Yeah. Anyway, we welcome everybody to this this meeting tonight of Independent Socialists in Wellingborough. We're getting quite a reputation for organising some really good discussions and debates, and under lockdown and using Zoom, we're getting more and more people from all over the place joining our meetings. So it's really good and welcome. If you could mute, except for the speakers, Susan and Ron, if you could mute yourselves, it stops background noise interfering with the presentation. The chat function is operative, so if you want to communicate with people during the course of the discussion using chat, you can do that. The plan for this evening is that Ron will go first. I think that's what we agreed, didn't we, Ron? I can't remember.
I don't remember. It's all right. I'm fine either way.
If you would make that decision, that's fine with me.
Okay, Ron, you go first, then Susan. Be about 10 to 15 minutes of presentation, and then we'll be into questions, discussion, debate, and what have you. When it comes to the discussion and debate, you'll need to use either the function under participants where you can wave. You click on participants, and there's a kind of the function whereby you can put up a hand to speak. Or you can just wave like this. Actually, in some ways, if you've got you're showing your screen, that's much easier to see. Anyway, let's kick off. Ron, over to you, and thank you very much for coming this evening, Ron.
It's my pleasure. I'm going to address three areas related to the recent election, although they're not going to be equally discussed by me, and I'll explain why. Because I think there's one area which I think is tended to be ignored by most people who have been writing or commenting on the recent election. The first area I want to talk about is what does the Biden victory actually mean? The second I'm going to look at is what can be expected from the Biden presidency. And the last one, the one I'm going to devote more time to, is trying to explain the vitality of the forces that Trump represents, because I think that's the one that I think has been neglected generally in the commentary that I've read. Well, to be succinct as possible, I think the Biden victory, I think, represents a victory against authoritarian government, a victory against basically a refusal to accept science, and even in many respects a victory against racism. Although we have to recognize that 70 million people voted for Trump, and many of those people have bought into a white nationalist narrative. I think also, that the Biden victory might represent for the allies of the United States, basically, a return to multilateralism rather than the unilateral decisions made by the Trump administration. What can be expected from a Biden presidency? As a centrist who basically did not run on a policy program, he basically ran on, I'm not Trump, I'm going to restore democracy, I'm going to basically take the COVID-19 virus more seriously. I think the expectations have to be very modest. On the domestic front, I think we might see more decisive action around the COVID-19 virus, maybe some addressing of the issue of racial justice, although I don't think we're going to see anything about taking forward the demands made by the Black Lives Matter movement, talking about defunding the police. And we might see, and I think this is one thing I think I may be more hopeful about, is an overturning of 150 executive orders that Trump has issued, which have basically wiped out environmental and health and safety protection. On the foreign policy front, again, I think maybe modest expectations. Maybe the United States will reconsider its support for Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen, possibly re-engagement with Iran over the nuclear agreement that was reached in 2015, maybe some softening of the sanctions against Cuba, particularly the latest one, which basically has made it impossible for Western Union to process any remittance payments going back to Cuban relatives of those people living overseas. But I think what I have to close on is a very sober note. And this I came across, I think, reading a New York Times article. And this comes from an African-American woman, 41-year-old woman who works for the Detroit public school system. And she was a bit scathing about the Democrats. And this is what she had to say. But they, Democrats, have spines that are made out of ramen, which is kind of a Japanese broth. So basically, you're talking about no substantial backbone. They are completely unwilling to stand up and fight back. And I think there's a grain of truth to that. The Democrats basically, by choosing Biden, picked someone who they thought was a safe pair of hands, who would not antagonize the public, and basically played it very safe and did not raise any serious policy issues. So the Green New Deal, for example, I think is dead in the water. I think Medicare for all is possibly dead in the water as well. But I think largely because the Republicans either are going to retain control of the Senate, which is the upper house of Congress, or they will at least basically make life as difficult for Biden as possible. We have to recall when Obama was president of the United States, the Republicans' strategy was basically to undermine that presidency. And I think the Republican Party is now even more spiteful, basically under the influence of Trump. And I think the Biden presidency possibly will not be as effective as many of his supporters would hope. I want to devote more attention to trying to explain the vitality of the forces that underpin Trump. I think most commentators tend to have a very short-term understanding of the issue. They're very ahistorical. They don't want to think in the longer term. I would think the roots of Trump maybe go back as far as 1968. All right. I remember 1968 very well. I was at the Democratic Party convention in August. I was protesting against the war in Vietnam. And I remember also the Black Power movement and the forces fighting for racial justice in the United States. And that triggered a response, not only from Nixon, who was the Republican candidate, but more significantly, and this is where I think Trump actually takes his playbook from, that is George Wallace. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama, and he ran on a campaign of law and order, racial segregation, and basically he took loads of votes from Hubert Humphrey, who was a Democratic Party candidate, and Nixon won a close election. In the 1970s, you start to see movements against tax increases, particularly in California, against increases in the sales tax, which is a value-added tax in our country, which funds the public education system, the state school system. You had also the rise of the evangelical Christian right, which basically was a reaction against feminism, against the right to choose, women's ability to control their bodies. And this gave rise to a new conservative movement, which helped to elect Ronald Reagan as president in 1980. And then Reagan gave voice basically to a new right agenda, including deregulation of industry, deregulation of environmental standards, privatization, and more significant tax cuts. And Reagan's message was the government was part of the problem, was not part of the solution. So it was basically a revolt against the New Deal legacy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So to make a long story short, in the 21st century, we have another movement which picks up from Reagan and picks up from the tax revolt in the 1970s. And this was called the Tea Party movement. Tea Party movement was a very diverse movement, but basically it has a common theme: anti-establishment, anti-liberal elite, anti-status, anti-tax, and also elements of xenophobia. Now, the xenophobia of the Tea Party movement was an undercurrent, but basically it was one that helped lead to even more popular support for the conservative movement. Now, so Trump comes along, okay, and he's tapping some of these forces by talking about, I'm going to clear out the swamp. You know, this is another way of him saying I'm anti-establishment, and saying these forces basically have let down people. And there was a grain of truth to what Trump was saying, because if you look at the anxiety that many people felt about immigration, this goes back to the 1970s, undocumented workers coming from Mexico, particularly in states, the border states like New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. This was raising a great deal of anxiety, particularly from people who felt threatened by the possible loss of jobs, the threat to their cultural identity. And there was no serious attempt, basically, to resolve the issue of immigration. Congress failed, successive Democratic and Republican administrations have failed as well. So there was a great deal of resentment, popular resentment built up against the national government. But I think this only explains in part why Trump's popularity is still very much intact. You have to keep that in mind. The forces that Trump appealed to still remains very solid, and it's not surprising that I've read somewhere that he's actually going to try to form a national committee and possibly set up a series of TV networks after he leaves the White House, basically to keep this base intact. But I think there's two other points I need to make here, and I probably should have made them earlier. And one is that part of the reaction among the electorate in the United States stems from two other long-standing trends. One is deindustrialization. The Rust Belt, the so-called Rust Belt, which is the Mideast and Midwest, has saw a devastation of heavy industry. And the fallout of that is the collapse of the labor movements. At one stage in the late 70s, about 25–26% of workers were represented by unions. Now it's 10%. In private industry, it's 6%. Without that collective voice, all right, you have an atomized working class that basically is much more prone to messages from demagogues like Trump. Secondly, I think the United States hegemony has been challenged. And this is a very important point. The United States, at one stage, was the lone superpower after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it found that its power was very limited, very constrained. They were able to remove Saddam Hussein. They were able to kick out the Taliban in Afghanistan. They were able to get rid of Gaddafi in Libya. But what did they get from that? More anarchy, more chaos. Their foreign policy goals in those countries basically have not been achieved. And then you have the rise of China. Now, China represents a major threat to the United States in political economic terms, not so much militarily, but China is expanding its economic reach into Latin America, which was considered to be the backyard of the United States. And China is now negotiating deals with Colombia, with Bolivia, with Mexico, investing very heavily in Mexico's oil industry and other industries in Latin America. And in Africa as well, they've made inroads which threaten US transnational corporations. So I think the US hegemony, I think, has been threatened, and this has posed a reaction. So when Trump talks about making America great again, what he's talking about is making America the superpower, unchallenged, and basically to have its way in global politics. This is basically under threat. So I think I might close there. I'm not quite sure if I even reach 15 minutes, but I just wanted to make those general points. I think it's much more important to have a general discussion rather than hearing from so-called experts. And I'm looking forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
Okay. Hi. Okay. My the way I'm approaching is very similar to Ron, but I'm going to try to talk a little bit more about the election, what Trump has done, the impact of neoliberalism, which is essentially what Ron just was talking about, because that has had created severe problems for the U.S. Working class, and of course led to the demise of the trade union movement. But there has been some recovery, but I'll talk to that. So unfortunately, when I'm nervous, I talk in a way where I make jokes, and that's the way I cope with things. So I'm sorry for this in advance. I'm approaching this discussion from an old spaghetti Western because it's starting to look ridiculous at this point. So I'm going to begin with the good, I'll deal with the bad, and then I'm going to deal with the really ugly towards the end, and what we should be doing, what the left should be doing in the US, and how we should be supporting them. Okay, so what's good? There is good. Donald Trump has been defeated, irrespective of his protestations, his tepanettrums, all this. He can cause recounts all he wants. He can stamp his feet. He can wreck the White House, and he can refuse to leave the White House. But he's lost. Now, this is a major positive result of the election. In fact, this is the first time that a far-right populist has been defeated electorally. So I don't know if it's the start of something good, because I don't think that Trump is disappearing, but it's still a major thing because Trump not only impacts the US, Trump impacts the rest of us, and the spread of the far right internationally is being closely coordinated. So an additional plus, which is a great thing. We're socialists, we want participation and at least some form of bourgeois democracy because that's important. We want it extended. Is an amazing number of people that voted in the election. And in this context, I want to talk about mail-in votes, which enabled people to vote that might not have been able to vote for any number of reasons. Now, this doesn't eliminate the historical problems of voter suppression in the US, which are significant, okay? But it's allowed people who wanted to vote to register and get the ballots and send them in. Now, just talking a little bit about voter suppression in this period, in this election, the Republicans tried to suppress 127,000 votes in Texas, all right? They failed, all right? They made it difficult for people to vote in cities. There was one drop-off box per county. Now, there are population density differences between places in Texas. So, if you live in some small outside, very far outside in rural areas, you have a smaller population. If you're in Harris County, that's another story altogether because you're looking at cities that are humongous. Houston has grown tremendously, so has Dallas. So they only had one drop-off box. This was, which was also part of a lawsuit to deal with. It was also an attempt in California by the Republicans to put up non-legal ballot boxes, okay? So there was a call for Trump supporters to stand outside voting places on days in which elections were occurring. And there were some problems. People showed up armed, okay? This is classic voter suppression in the old form of they had Jim Crow laws, and which supposedly were taken care of by the Voting Rights Act way back under Lyndon Johnson, okay? So now, but this election is the highest percentage of voters in American history. Part of this is due to enabling voters to get the votes in, which probably reduced abstention somewhat because people recognize it was an important election. But also remember that while Biden has one of the highest number of votes in US history, Donald Trump is number 2, okay? I'm going to talk to this a little later. The final point I wanted to raise here on the good, okay, is that the number of votes that happened for Democrats in Georgia. Now, even if Biden winds up losing Georgia, this is actually impressive because they were still suffering under severe voter suppression, which was very clear in the 2018 gubernatorial race in which Stacey Abrams was defeated. Now, after her defeat, she basically, along with members of the Black community and including Movement for Black Labor and Black Lives Matter, went out and registered a lot of voters and made sure they were able to get their votes in. And this other reason that happened, of course, is a demographic one. There's a massive amount of urban sprawl around Atlanta and some of the cities. Now, the question that is up in the air now is whether or not the 2 open Senate seats in Georgia could be won, and whether this group of people that actually came out and got Biden in will be able to work for the 2 Senate seats. Possibly not. I would say probably not, because the Republican vote was split in one. The Democratic vote was split, but it was still not enough. And there were libertarians running. So we have to see. It depends on when they can hold this coalition. This is important to the Republicans as it is to the Democrats, because at this point, the Republicans have 48 seats. The Democrats have 46 seats in the Senate, plus 2 independents, which vote with them, which are Bernie Sanders and Angus King. Okay, so let's talk about the bad. Okay, 72.5 million people in the US actually believe that Donald Trump actually holds views and does things that represent them. This is horrifying when you think about it. There is widespread speculation that if it wasn't for the pandemic, Trump would have easily won a second term, okay? And the reason for this is that the economy was good. This is a fruition of the policies put in during the Obama administration, but that doesn't matter, okay? But the pandemic got a lot of people going out to vote. Now, Trump's gross mishandling of the pandemic probably cost him the election, the economic collapse and the number of votes. And Trump's adamant refusal to listen to scientists, not only on the pandemic, but on climate change and a whole host of other issues, did not help him in the least. His constant insistence that the pandemic is coming to an end as death counts mounted obviously upset people, unsurprisingly. Okay, another bad problem. Biden ran the election on an argument of unite America and empathy. Now, alas, this does not sell well with the 72.5 million people that still supported Trump. His coalition between the center-right Dems and right-wing anti-Trump Republicans did not win everyone over to his side. An obvious mistake that is pretty obvious to me is that this didn't speak to the Trump base, who had already bought into the hate, divide, and rule, and the desperation to be one rung on the ladder above Black people and Latin people and women, because that's very important, okay? They really don't care what a bunch of rich Republicans say to vote. They don't care. They don't give a damn, okay? So how much headway this argument made and the winning over all these right-wing anti-Trump Republicans is debatable. How much headway did it make with the working class? Who knows? Who supported Trump? Now, unfortunately, and this is another bad, Biden and the Dem leadership are still concentrating on trying to woo Republicans rather than stand with the people that actually campaigned and voted for them. And those include progressive and members of the left horrified by the possibility of an open, let's call it authoritarian instead of fascist, Trump in power for another 4 years, okay? The damage that Trump has done may never be fixed in many of our lifetimes, especially in the judiciary. And that doesn't only mean the Supreme Court. It's the whole entire judiciary, that federal judiciary, that he's appointed people who ideologically support his positions, okay? And that is a real problem. And also our climate change deniers, a lot of them. Now, the hate he's used to play divide and rule with, like I said, at least one generation to push back into the margins. Yes, I agree completely with Ron that it was George Wallace that best represents Trump, and this is the basis of this, and unfortunately it's a return to this nightmare. But at the same time, they were pushed to the margins somewhat. They were there, but people, didn't walk around. Those that were walking around openly in Nazi regalia were looked upon as distasteful. Okay, at this point, they don't need to walk around with Nazi regalia, and this is a serious problem. Okay, now the problem of the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to the SCOTUS Supreme Court, I refer to her as Serena Joy for a very good reason. Given her historical ideological biases on the Circuit Court, she's on the right, especially on civil liberties. There's no question that Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton will be overturned, which will return abortion rights to the states. And and also during her questioning, she was asked about Griswold versus Connecticut. She refused to answer whether that was a safe decision. That decision actually allowed married couples to buy birth control and use it, and according to their privacy. The fact that she wouldn't assert that was a safe decision is something to be worried about, because that affects a whole swathe of judicial things, including marriage equality and all these things. And the whole thing comes off of Griswold. So that's a really serious problem. Now, if you want, I can give statistics on how many states have laws in that have limited or practically ban abortion once Roe goes down. I have the whole data on that from the Guttmacher Institute, what this means. So what this means is that there's going to be a need for an abortion support network like we have in Britain that provides funds for travel, procedure, and for staying overnight. And that's going to be needed for women living in abortion restricted and abortion illegal states. Now, that might not be enough, because one of the big problems is there are going to be swathes of the US where women will not be able to obtain legal abortions, okay? And that means that women may be forced or will be forced into unsafe abortions, which risk their lives and their health. Additional worries coming up for Griswold with marriage equality, any civil rights legislation that still exists that they haven't destroyed yet, and environmental regulations, as Ron raised. Okay, now some of those can be overturned by executive order, but not the Supreme Court things. And one of the biggest problems, if they wanted to, let's say, pass legislation through the Senate, which I'm going to talk about, they don't have the votes. Okay, and McConnell has already said that he's talking about restricting people being appointed by Biden in terms of his cabinet. And he's definitely, given the game he played in the last 2 years of Obama's presidency, he is going to try to block as much legislation as they get through. Now, this is a problem, and I'll explain a little bit more. The Dems' victory, as we said, not a blue wave. In fact, like I said, they didn't win the Senate. And one of the problems that we're going to deal with is that unless they get these 2 votes in Georgia, in which case Kamala Harris can actually be the 51st vote and get it through, any progressive, and I'm putting that very small progressive, things that Biden was arguing for, like he doesn't support single-payer healthcare. Biden supports adding a public option, not single-payer healthcare. And or any of the Green New Deal, and it is much weaker than the ones that was initially advanced by the left wing of the Democratic Party, which addressed fracking and wanted far more regulation and money invested and moved towards a sustainable energy production that Biden himself is doing. So now here's the problem. While Biden defeated Trump, he did not defeat Trumpism, which is still largely intact, with 72.5 million voters supporting it. And the problem, as we can see with Trumpism, amongst other things, that it contained the normalization of the far right. Read as fascists, because most of these people are fascists. There's some of them white supremacists, but a lot of them are fascists, okay? And open and ugly racism, misogyny, disableism, and homophobia and transphobia. These were all part of Trump's, so we say, agenda or group of things. These things have always existed in the US, and with the exception of misogyny, the extreme versions of this hate have been marginalized. And now after all these years back, these positions have been normalized. They are accepted into mainstream discourse, and that is frightening. Okay,
Susan,
yes.
You've got 3 minutes.
Okay, very quickly.
Approximately 3 minutes.
Very quick then. So he needed to defeat Trump and Trumpism, but that needed him to win by a very wide margin rather than a squeaker of an election. Okay, the really ugly. Very quickly, Democratic strategy of uniting the center right and the right of the Republican independents was essentially, meant that left Dems, that is progressives and the left outside the party were marginalized. Chief among these people were Bernie Sanders and the Justice Democrats, but also progressives like Julian Castro, Elizabeth Warren. I didn't see hide nor hair of them during the election period. And I was watching CNN religiously, and which is probably why I'm neurotic at the moment. The Dem leadership is now blaming the progressive and left Dems for losing seats in the House of Representatives. And what they've done by doing this is the Democratic leadership marginalized the young and the grassroots activists, okay? Now, convincing the Dems, the Dem leadership that the left and the party played an important role in the election and represent a lot of people is going to take some doing, because the Dems are truly divided. Okay, now, let's talk about Black Lives Matter and moving for Black Lives, who I've already talked about in Atlanta. They have been very active in registering people and getting people out to vote. And they're a big problem for Biden. And because Biden himself for the left is a significant problem. The 1994 crime bill, which is responsible for the criminalization of poverty and the mass incarceration of Black people, Black men specifically, was drafted by Biden in the Senate. Okay, people are not happy about that. They were worried. If you were maybe only Ron and I remember the nightmare that is the Clarence Thomas nomination, where he treated Anita Hill, who was talking about this man's historical sexual harassment, as a nuisance. He didn't do anything to help her. He also refuses to oppose the Hyde Amendment. I can respond on that later if you need it. Okay, now this is a really serious problem. Okay, because what's going to happen in this case is, how are they going to deal with the impact of the 94 crime bill? Because they don't want to eliminate it. So they can limit at the federal level the sale of military goods to the police forces. That they can do. All right. But one of the big problems is that a lot of the stuff, the only thing that the Dem leadership will do is offer reforms. Now, Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter have a problem because the NAACP and the Urban League do not support defunding the police. They think the only thing they can get is these tiny reforms. You know, one of these reforms, which has been changed in New York, was that it was illegal for police to use a chokehold, but they were never convicted or put on trial for using a chokehold. So they finally have now made it that if you use one, you will go to prison. Oh, wow. That's a real help. These are the things that should have been done decades ago, and they just left them there. Okay. And the problem is that this is one of the reasons why, well, Black women stayed with Biden. Some Black men shifted over to Trump. And that's a problem, because an election this close, losing even the support of some percentage of Black voters is serious, and that costs. Okay. Now, I just want to talk 1 minute very quickly about the use of racism, the use of red baiting, which was an essential part of Trump's election. All right. So we have open anti-Semitism, which, you know, which is quite evident. You see it from the far right that was protesting, and you hear it from Trump himself. Everybody took, oh, I helped Israel. Who cares? Because most Jews do not think that the embassy should be in Jerusalem. Most Jews in the US do not hold that position. I don't care what happens in Britain, but I know what's happening in the American Jewish community, who came out in support of immigration, of children, of protecting children who were separated from the parents, protecting people who are entering the country, and against his Muslim bill, which prevented Muslims from entering the country. All right. High level, the return of really virulent anti-Semitism in the form of Judeo-Bolshevism has been heard. And that's amazing. And then, of course, the Jews own the media and the finance sector, because that's clear. The second thing, of course, is the link that he made over and over again between the Jews who were seen as Muslims, the Jews who were seen as Marxists, anarchists, and Antifa, to the Blacks, because he then said, Movement for Black Lives Matter was actually not a Black autonomous organization, but run by Marxists, anarchists, and Antifa. This is a problem, okay? So, as Ron said, Biden, I don't even think he was a liberal. He is a conservative, and he has always been so. All right, come on, think of working with white supremacists in the Senate to try to get rid of a busing of Black children. All right, this is Biden, okay? So,
Susan, I'm going to have to
that's it. I'm stopping now. Right, but the left needs to, 2 seconds. The left needs to unite the movements, be prepared to fight against Trump's wackos, but also to push the Democrats and keep on pushing them. And that's what the left needs to be doing now.
Thank you very much, Susan. Okay, so now it's open for discussion, questions. So if you could indicate if you want to speak. I'm looking, I can't see anybody's hand up yet. Anybody? Chet, they're coming thick and fast now. Chet first, then Paul, and then Dave and Canella.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Lovely. So Susan, Ronald, thanks very much. I'd just like to address 1 or 2 points. Susan, you said that the left is being blamed over in the States for the losses for the Democrats in the House. And as I understand it, all of those who worked with AOC, all of those who were in marginal constituency, often having come through the Justice Democrats, who were fighting for a proper healthcare system. Every single one of them who was running won, and they won in marginal constituencies as well. However, on the other hand, those who are running in marginal constituencies who had rejected AOC, who were corporate Democrats, who were not offering universal health care, all of them lost. So the pushback hasn't even begun from the left, and it really does need to, I believe. And even AOC was on the back foot in an interview I saw recently when she needn't be. But anyway, I'd just like to say, anybody talking to the Americans, tell them they're wrong. I mean, tell them they're wrong on that point. So not on everything. The other thing is, I know that you're looking at the history of Biden, and there's lots of damning stuff there. I'd also just like to point out that the Yes We Can campaign from Obama, despite all his virtues and all his public image, he did very, very little to deserve any credit. He didn't restrain the police force. He didn't look after the protesters at DAPL. The banks that were too big to fail grew bigger and merged. Every different metric, even his Obamacare was a rebranded Romney Care, which was really not what was needed. And all it did was send the insurance companies' shares sky high. So I think the disappointment of Yes We Can pushed people to a radical possibility of maybe this outsider con man actually can do something for us. And the one thing I would say is Trump didn't seem to start as many wars, because as I understand it, Obama inherited 2 from Bush, started 5 himself, cleaned them up so they're all done from 30,000 feet, and stopped bodies from coming back because it was done by mercenaries. So in that case, Obama actually expanded the war front, and Trump wasn't effective in doing that for whatever reason, probably by accident.
Thanks, Chair. I'm going to take 2 more. Paul Repetti, is it? And then Dave and Canella. So Paul first.
This is the first time I've watched an American election all the way through. I didn't understand this fear of socialism, when socialism can bring them healthcare and benefits. They don't seem to understand what it means. So where does this fear come from?
Thank you, Paul. Dave and Canella, and then we'll go back to Susan and Ron to respond.
Okay, yeah, I'm just unmuting myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I think it's quite interesting to see how Keir Starmer reacted to the election, because his main message in The Guardian was that the secret of Biden's success was to be tough on security, to be strong on the family, and above all, to be united and to have a united party and in fact, a moderate coalition. And I'd be interested to see what Ron and Susan think about that. It's interesting, I think, some people already mentioned the fact that in some of the key areas like Wisconsin, Georgia, other places, the progressives and the left actually played an important role in winning the election. They were crucial states. If they'd lost those states, we'd have still had Trump. So I think Starmer's been a bit naive to think that by expelling the left or smashing the left, somehow the Democrats would have been better. Having said that, obviously, it is very tricky for the left in the states, because the Democratic Party, though it has links with the unions, isn't the same as Labour Party. It's not an independent in any sense of the bourgeoisie. I mean, the bourgeoisie, like in America, the ruling class, have 2 parties, Republicans and the Democrats. But obviously, tactically, it's quite tricky. And I'd like to hear what Susan and Ron think about the tactics, in particular, the Democratic Socialists of America, which is quite a big organization, increased a lot in the recent years. And it's very interesting. They seem to take advantage of the fact that on one level, the Democratic Party isn't as tight and structured as the Labour Party in terms of you can get on the ballot in these places by challenging them in their primary elections. I mean, like that's how Bernie Sanders got on the ticket, because he's not a member of the Democrat Party, but he can stand in these primary elections. So if you can organise your base, as some people have done in Chicago and other places, if you're left people, socialist-minded people in states, if you organise your base, you can actually defeat the sort of right-wing conservative Democrats and get elected, and then form a local base and build from there. Obviously, the problem then is you still have to have a strategy more long term, I think, where you have to look about breaking the Democratic Party and forming some sort of independent Labour Party. But that's a different sort of discussion. But I think rather than the old Trotskyist position, if you like, which was very much we have to form an independent Labour Party, which is theoretically right, I think the situation now, you've got to be tactically quite flexible about how you approach that. And I think it seems to me that there has been some progress made in this way in the last decade or so. I'd like to know what people think about that. Okay.
Thank you, Dave. Susan, did you want to respond first? And then Ron.
Of course. Okay. Chet, completely agree. Of course. You know, the thing about the Justice Democrats that's amazing, because I actually just checked recently, is, you know, they started off with 4. It was AOC, it was Presley from Massachusetts, Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, and Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. Okay, and this ties into what Dave was saying earlier, you know, who just came in. Elliot Engel, who was a longtime conservative Dem, who was a horrible, annoying right-wing Zionist, has been defeated by Jamal Bowman. That was a wonderful moment. I was so glad I could contribute to his campaign. AOC is my representative, so I get a little bit of pleasure. The only time I vote, I can vote for her. So, and there's also Cori Bush is another person who's come in, the same thing. Jayapal and from Washington, and Ro Khanna. Yeah, so we can, there, as Dave says, there is possibility. And in fact, AOC got rid of one of the most annoying, and he was the next in line after Nancy Pelosi to take over the Dems in the House. And that was Joseph Crowley. And I was so glad to see him go. We're trying for decades, at least a decade, to get rid of this man. And they wouldn't allow a primary. And it's the first thing the Dems did, they primaried every single one of the Justice Democrats, and they lost. And you're right. Okay, so this is a very, very positive thing. Okay. Yes, I agree completely. Obama did bloody nothing. They could have dealt with some of these problems relating to the 1994 crime. But I mean, there were police armed like a military killing people on the streets. Okay, this is outrageous. Why? And he didn't do anything. What, small little reforms? Little reforms do not deal with systemic and structural racism in the US, which is an essential part of how this country has always been organized. It doesn't. And they needed to do something, they didn't. So, you know, this is one of those things where, okay, yes, we can have a person of color, this is a great thing, but guess where their politics are? And that's always been a problem. You know, so they're all excited now about Kamala Harris. You know who her father is, by the way. He's a Marxist economist named Don Harris. Unfortunately, like with the Miliband, she falls very far from the tree. But on the one hand, she was also the prosecutor in California. And she, like what's going on here, when kids were skipping school, she was trying to jail their parents. There are issues here. And unfortunately, I don't expect Biden to do much. All right, the Justice Democrats, as you said, are only started. They started talking about getting rid of the Electoral College. This was an original anti-democratic thing, and it should, but that's going to take a constitutional amendment. So we haven't got the ERA through yet. So we're still waiting for women to be equal under the law. So who knows? Yeah, socialism. Why? Because this goes back even further than George Wallace. Okay, this goes back to probably the Russian Revolution, but let's talk about why Roosevelt actually was forced to put in the New Deal. Okay, there were actually large numbers of people, the communists there, socialists there, and the New Deal was an attempt to stop it. They were forced to stop the left. Now then, of course, after the post-war and after their great alliance with the Soviet Union during World War II, then there's the Cold War. And this has been a very effective thing that they tried out, but I hadn't heard this much red baiting in ages, and the whole entire discussion on healthcare is ridiculous. I mean, so socialized medicine is socialism, or even better, the public option is a gateway towards socialism. And you're looking at this and you're like, are you? And this is not only the Republicans we expect idiocy. This is also part of the Dems. And remember that the Dems participated on the House Un-American Activities Committee. Yes, Bobby Kennedy was sitting right next to Roy Cohn and the lovely McCarthy. So understanding this gives you a better understanding of the states. Yeah, the way one always very old thing since the Russian Revolution has been, they're coming to indoctrinate your children and take away your television. And this is something, for some reason, that seems to work. Now, there are left-wing unions that have always been, there's been some of them that is still existing, like United Electrical Workers. It still exists. That was set up by the CP back in the day. And there are some that have moved to the left. But you also, as Ron pointed out correctly, the heart of, for example, United Auto Workers, which is a good left union, is Detroit, which has been destroyed, okay, by deindustrialization, okay? So,
Thank you, sir.
I think I'm going to left the rest to Ron.
Let's take Ron in now.
I'm going to give the left to Ron. Go ahead.
Okay, Ron. Yeah.
One of the difficulties I think we have when we make general observations about either party, and particularly in the United States, we're talking about a completely different political and electoral system. We're talking about a country of over 330 million people, 50 individual states. So when you have a national election, you have local elections as well. So you have to look at local conditions often to make any astute observations about why a particular candidate won. It's a completely different kettle of fish from this country, all right? So when Starmer talks about a united party, yes, you could have a united party because you have a manifesto, which each and every candidate for parliament is expected to stand on. United States, you don't have a national manifesto, all right? You have individual candidates who could possibly, if they're wise, address local issues, all right? If you're running for Congress, particularly if you're running for the lower house, all right, you run every 2 years, all right? You have to be in touch with your constituents and know what issues are most important to them. So if you're AOC representing the South Bronx, all right, and Northern Queens, one of the issues you're going to be emphasizing is obviously housing, okay? And even adequate public services, all right? And particularly education, particularly fire protection, and even policing. Because you got to keep in mind, many people living in inner city communities are victims of crime. So they want adequate policing. They don't want people to be shot in the streets. You know, they want innocent people to be killed, but they still want public services. So I think we have to keep that in mind. I think Dave's point about local progressive forces making a difference in particular states is spot on, particularly in the major cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Chicago. They were grassroots organizations working for progressive change. They didn't have any illusions about Biden, but they definitely didn't want to see Trump reelected because that would kill any prospects for any meaningful change. All right. Paul's point about socialism, you know, why? Well, I'm going to be very careful here, but in the United States, you have almost a cult of individualism. You have a notion that people, by their own efforts, basically lift themselves up. You have the so-called rags to riches myth, you know, that anybody basically, if they apply themselves, could make their dream come true. And you even have, it's all part of the political and civic culture in the United States. I'll give you an example how, to what lengths this could be taken. There was a candidate running for a state office, I think it was in Illinois, 1870s, who said, I was born in a log cabin that I built myself. Now, anyone listened to that would say, that's ludicrous. But he felt compelled basically to say the log cabin method, so by Abraham Lincoln, basically, who basically was born from a humble background and then became president of the United States. This is part of the mythology in the United States. So people feel if you're living in poverty, well, it's your own fault, all right? You haven't applied yourself, you haven't got an education, you know, you're wasting your time smoking weed, you're hanging out with your friends rather than basically getting a job, whatever. So you have to understand that this is part of the cultural fabric of the United States. And this is very much runs right through conservative thought. And that's the reason why you have the suspicion of a welfare state, any kind of state initiatives, basically, to help provide services and provide assistance to people, basically, to level the playing field. Because in the United States, you still have this myth, basically, it's a land of opportunity and you can make it if you try. So I think, you know, the argument about socialism, it's not about the fear of foreign power, you know, like in the 50s, you know, communists, you know, working hand in glove with the Soviet Union is going to basically subvert the United States security. It's not that. It's much more deeply cultural, and I think it's much more difficult to combat when you try to argue for some kind of progressive state interventions which could make a difference in people's lives.
Okay, thank you. Let's open it up again. More questions or contributions? Tony Banks, and Sean, did you want to say something? You're next.
Yeah.
Tony, if you unmute.
I'm wondering whether Susan and Ron can say something more about the squad and about the left in the Democrat Party. I'm not quite sure how new this is. I'm not sure whether it has its origins earlier, but I do find it, and I think many of us do, quite an inspiring and you know, and something that offers something in the future.
Thanks, Tony. Where's Sean? Sean, if you unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks, Susan. It's something besides the election. I've just always been fascinated by working class movements in America, and you know, I went to New York and I've seen some of the public housing that trade unions built, the garment workers built. You know, housing. We weren't actually projects, but there's a few sort of like building public housing that the unions had built, and it's something we don't realize in this country. I think a lot of people, that the powerful movement that was the trade union movement was, and hopefully will be in America. And it's, I mean, from the books of Upton Sinclair to John Steinbeck, all those. I love that, the Upton Sinclair books as well, you know. But the question I was going to ask, this really broad question, it just came across me watching the election. And do you think America's just too big?
Size matters.
No, I mean in just the diversity of it, the way it's structured. As Ron was pointing out about, you know, the different emphasis in different parts of the country on the electorate. It came across me when I think, is America just too big? I don't even mean geographically. I mean, it's psychologically even. You know. Anyway, I'll pose that question.
Okay.
Well, I think it's not just too big. It's, I think, more to the point, it's a very diverse country. Not just racially and ethnically, but culturally as well. And obviously, we're seeing this manifested in greater political polarization. I never knew a time when both political parties, which basically Democrats and Republicans have been defenders of capitalism ever since their creation. They both depend on corporate funding for their campaigns. They're basically wedded to protecting the United States empire, but now they're at each other's throats. I mean, if you just turn back the clock to the early 1970s, Richard Nixon, when he was president of the United States, all right, you had progressive legislation being passed by Congress, and Nixon never vetoed it. He went along with it, all right? Republicans and Democrats were able to even cooperate over civil rights legislation in the 1960s. You cannot find any common ground among Republicans and Democrats now over any major piece of legislation or any foreign policy initiative, basically. So I think it's not just a question of being too big. We're talking about a very divided country, a very diverse country. But I also will make this observation, and I think we often forget this, living in this country. And when I used to lecture to my students, I would make it very clear that the United States represents a true federal system, right? So all these people, the Brexiteers, were talking about, the evil of federalism represented by the EU. They didn't know what they were talking about. A federal system devolves certain rights and powers to states. The individual states, for example, and this could be a problem, as already I think Susan made reference to, about control over elections. It's centered in the states. So states could set up, qualifications to register, the whole procedures to register. They could make it impossible, even for example, Florida, making it impossible for former felons, people who have actually been sentenced to prison and paid their debt to society. Now they have to literally come up with money to compensate the government for all that they might have done, the cost of their incarceration, to compensate the state for that. So the education system is basically a federal system. So each state basically has its own curriculum. There's no such thing as a national curriculum, all right? Now, to a certain extent, that could be seen as an asset or even a strength that you have devolved powers, because state legislatures could have the authority to pass progressive legislation, and they do, all right? New York State is a good example. California is another example, all right? So you could actually almost bypass Congress. So one more example about this: when Trump withdrew from the Paris climate change accords, what to do? A number of states took the initiative to pass their own regulations to control carbon emissions. All right, you could never have that in Great Britain, all right, because everything is centralized. There is no local possibility for initiatives of that sort. So I'll stop there.
Susan?
Okay. I actually want to talk a little bit about what Ron said about the state, because this is a very interesting thing, specifically in Florida. So they actually had a plebiscite in Florida to overturn the law that people who had committed a felony cannot lose their civil rights to vote forever. And the plebiscite won, so that people theoretically should be able to do it. And what they did was to do, as Ron said, they actually said, well, you have to pay us back for all this in order for you to vote. Now, this prevention of people, and it differs in different states. So there's some states that will not allow you, to vote if you're on parole. There are some who will let you vote after parole, and some that never had this, but these were portable Jim Crow laws. And these Jim Crow laws literally terrorized Blacks living in the South, prevented them from rights that they theoretically were entitled to have. They were terrorized. There's no other word to describe it. If you looked the wrong way, you talked the wrong way, you didn't show proper respect to white people, you could be in very deep trouble. That's why so many Blacks got the hell out of there when they could to work in industries up in the North, like Detroit. All right, so understanding racism in the US is essential to understand the US. Okay, and I agree completely with Ron. It's an incredibly diverse population. I mean, you can't talk about Latino or Latinx vote, because how people who are considered Latinos vote depends on where they were originally born or their families were born. So down in Florida, you've got expat Cubans and Venezuelans who are actually terrified of the evil of socialism. And in other places, people are long established, they're very progressive. In some places, there's been a rise of Protestant fundamentalism, and that's also affected voting. So there is no Latino or Latinx or Hispanic vote. So this is another one of those great myths where they try to lump everybody, just like there isn't a woman's vote, okay? Because if you looked at 2016, large amounts of white women voted for Donald Trump for God knows why, okay? because that is a vote for a man who's a misogynist, and he's made that quite clear. Okay, so, and I agree with Ron about the point on American culture, because that is a very important thing. And again, your failure to be rich is your fault. Your failure to, you don't have entrepreneurial spirits, you don't have animal spirits, it's never systemic injustice and racism in the society you're living. It's not the fact that Blacks can live in certain areas or couldn't live in certain areas, or the Jews couldn't stay at some hotels. They've managed to get past that, but it's things like that women do not have control of their own body's reproduction. In many states, as soon as Roe and Wade is overturned, we're talking South Dakota. There's one place in the whole of South Dakota that performs abortions. And the doctor who does it has to come from another state because he's terrified that he's going to be killed. Year after year, they kept to try to pass plebiscites to ban abortion. And now they finally managed to do it. So if Roe goes down, the abortion ban will fall right into place. So it's a diverse place. But imagine, you sit there wondering, one of my favorite things that happened was the anti-immigrant stuff, which we talked about earlier. So in Alabama, they forbade immigrants coming to pick the crops. Well, guess what happened to the crops in Alabama? They died on the vine. Now, this is brilliant. So here you go, because it's a similar thing that the Tories are having here. Oh, we don't want immigrants in this country, Priti Patel says. Well, who the hell did they come get in to pick the crop last summer? It wasn't white British people who hate foreigners so much. So it's it's a very different situation, and getting people in the US, getting people to understand why even the Electoral College exists, which was literally set up as a payoff to both slave states and former states with smaller populations, so they would join the Republic. So that's why there were Blacks and Native Americans were fractions of people, so they would get more representatives. Understanding this crap about the US helps to understand why things haven't changed. And that's all I want to say.
Could I perhaps ask a question at this point? Looking ahead to the future, from what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that things are pretty dire. Things aren't going to change that much. And yet the world faces some very, very serious crises over the next period, economic, environmental. And from what you're saying, the United States not really going to be playing any kind of role in solving these things at all, either under Biden. And so it sounds pretty depressing to me. I mean, I remember during the Obama years, people kept on saying Obama wants to change things, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt that he did, that he was more radical than perhaps he eventually he's seen. But he was blocked all the way down the line by the Republicans in the Senate and also in Congress as well, for lots of periods during the Obama period. So Biden's just going to be completely hamstrung, isn't he? Even if he wanted to do stuff, by the Supreme Court, by the Senate and the main. So it sounds pretty depressing from what you're saying. Was that a fair summary?
I think so, but I like to follow the adage of Gramsci, who basically talked about the optimism of the will, the pessimism of the intellect. Looking intellectually, basically you could say, well, nothing's going to change. But we also have to keep in mind that a third of the Senate will be up for re-election in 2022. Depending how Biden plays it, all right, he could basically argue, or the Democrats could argue, that the reason why things haven't changed is because the Republicans have blocked it. And I think one of the strengths that Biden has, and I think, I'm not so much into personal politics here, but Biden is an insider. He's been in Congress since 1974, something like that. He's developed pretty close working relationships with some of the Republicans, who basically have a grudging respect for him. So I think that he could, depending on his statesmanship and his political skills and his staff and so forth, basically soften up the Republicans. Maybe not immediately, but I think there could be a backlash against the Republican Party if if the changes that many people anticipate don't materialize, and the Democrats can pin it on the Republicans, it could be a backlash. Now, on a major critical issue here, and I think this is an issue that I think is the one that I think most of us would feel is the greatest threat to humankind, is climate change. I think it will make a major difference if the United States returns to the climate change accords of 2016, was it? I think it will make a difference. Symbolically, it would represent the United States as willing to play ball. It will help kickstart some kind of multilateral initiative, possibly to tackle climate change. So I think on that major issue, there is a potential. But on other issues, who knows?
I agree with Ron. So everything comes, because in many sense, he's a lot like Lyndon Johnson, who was an insider in he knew people, and that's why he was able to get so much legislation passed. So he knows a lot of people. He's friends with, God only knows why, but he's friends with a lot of these people. I think he even calls Mitch McConnell Mitch. I don't know why, but okay. But the most important thing, and this is the biggest worry, he's not a climate change denier. He believes in science has something to say. I mean, a lot of Republicans, these religious ones, don't believe in evolution, for heaven's sake. Okay, they don't. A lot of the problems they're having just dealing with the pandemic is just a complete, Trump doesn't believe in science. He denies what scientists say. Biden at least does, and he's already indicated he is going to sign again the Paris COP. He will participate probably in the next COP, which is, I believe, in Glasgow next year, and he will be active in that. And the other good thing, and this has been raised earlier, what might not be done at the national level can be done on the state level. And there are some really good things going on in a number of states. So hopefully climate change, because at this point, the situation is so dire that if they don't do anything, they're going to drag the whole planet down, and we need them to do something. And I think at least Biden is aware of it. He won't go the full yard that the Justice Democrats were asking. And he said, okay, we're slowly going to phase out oil and gas, and we're going to keep on going with fracking. But fracking, who needs it? If your oil and gas is not getting any money, you don't need fracking. So, but this is a geopolitical element to it. So where the U.S. thinks that a lot of its power relies upon its oil and gas. So there's a lot of things going here, but I'm hopeful. I'm not completely, but it would be sensible for him as well to sit there and wait a little before trying to push some of his things and failing. And because there will be midterm elections, he can push anything that they defeat on McConnell, including some of his own people he wants on his cabinet. So it's a very ugly situation. So again, there is local action. There is positive things happening on the ground. And the Black Lives Matter movement is serious. This is a serious movement, and it includes lots of young people. It has the support of young people. They can keep pushing, and they will keep pushing because they have no intention, and why should they, of being stuck in as third-rate citizens for their great-grandchildren to have to deal with. So there is some hope. There are big movements. The women's movement is a big movement. It blew up as soon as Trump was elected. This is positive.
Thank you.
That's it.
Tony, I noticed you wanted to come back. If you want to unmute.
I couldn't hear what you...
Anybody else want to indicate after Tony? Richard, and then Sean again. Okay, so Richard and Sean after Tony.
I just wanted to come back to the role of the left and the leadership that was offered by people like Sanders and IOC, and watching a woman called Cori Bush, I think, and her acceptance speech, just electrifying, just fantastic. As a, speech you don't come across every day, and it inspires you, and it makes you feel different, and it makes you feel hopeful. Is there, could you say something more? I take on board Ron's views of federalism and that there's local developments, but I mean, Trump was a national movement and had, and there was the background in the Tea Party and so forth and so on. So there are some national themes, and there is a requirement, I think, of a leadership on the left. I just wonder whether, there isn't a bit more hope. There isn't a bit more hope in those terms. I'm not sure how novel this whole, left of the Democratic Party. So perhaps it's always been there, but it seems to have come to the fore rather more since Sanders.
Thanks, Tony. Richard, and then Sean. You need to unmute, Richard.
Right. Hi. Yeah. Fantastic talks from Ron and Susan. Terrific. I've always been fascinated by incredibly sort of insular American politics is, and how few Americans hold passports, and how few American newspapers cover issues outside of the USA, and how kind of like American culture tends to expect the rest of the world to be fascinated with America, and fail us to understand it. But what I want to ask is a very specific question. Is the election of Biden good news for the Palestinians? Do we think in any way, shape or form?
Okay, Richard, we'll come to the answers in a second. Sean, right to unmute.
Yeah, thanks again. Just viewing and some of the interviews that were taking place on the streets actually, and looking at some of the grassroots campaigns and their support. I think it's a bit underplayed the role that the grassroots organisations did in getting voters out and voter registration. So for what I've seen just through the media here on 24-hour television, I'm slightly confident that there might be a change, at least a lot more collectivism and ground and activism within America. It's there. It's something, a lot of people in this country didn't realize that it's there. As Ron was saying, it's all about the individual and this American exceptionalism and stuff like that. But I was seeing there, and it always has been there. Always has been there. If you read American labor history and things like that. One thing that interested me, it was an interview with the governor of Hawaii that I heard on the radio, and he was saying if Trump had got in, that there would have been a bigger call for Hawaii to break away from America, because it's seen as quite a strong democratic state. Begs the question, why do America own Hawaii in the first place? But that's another story. But do you think there would be a movement for separation in some of the states? Not that I would advocate it. And just finally, before I go, there's a great Laurie Taylor program, Thinking Aloud, today. It's based on corruption, but it touches on America as well, about Mitch McConnell and his wife and the transport stuff and all that. So that's the two questions: separation, and do you think that could happen? And also, I'm encouraged about what I've seen about grassroots and collectivism so far in America.
Okay.
Can I answer?
Could I just say that after Susan and Ronald have finished, I think we'll wind up unless there's some really pressing question. So if you've got a pressing question, we'll take it right at the end. Chet, you seem to have a pressing question, but we'll do it at Susan and Ron.
I'm going to interrupt because Catherine Fritz was indicating earlier. I think you missed it.
That's what I was going to say.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Catherine. Sorry, I didn't. Sorry, Catherine. Do you want to say something now, and then we'll Susan and Ron can then wind up? I think that's probably the best way to play it.
Thanks very much. I'm not sure how much of this falls in the area of comment rather than question, but it seemed like some of the questions that people were raising, I might be able to contribute to the discussion. And there were a couple of areas in which I just wanted to make maybe an observation or two. One was people have talked quite properly about some of the various kinds of differences there are between the US and the UK. And I've lived over here for about 30 years now, whereas I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. And that's a very different environment from here. And perhaps it was a lovely environment for giving me a wider recognition, because Houston is an urban area. And it's changed during my lifetime to become even more of an urban area. But the big difference I've found in the various parts of the US I've lived in, and there have been several, is it's not even so much a difference between states as between rural areas and urban areas. And if you think about people in rural areas, I have to say that in Britain, people don't understand really what it's like to live in a rural area where you go for months without seeing people other than relatively close neighbors and family. You don't encounter strangers because you know all of the people who live within 60 miles of where you live. And there's not that many in many cases. That's rural. And that leads to people having a very individualist approach to life because, if you need something, you know somebody you can ask for help, and that's different, but that's part of being Horatio Alger and raising yourself up. It's not expecting the society in general to support you. So, and the emphasis there, and I was really rather dismayed, I guess, because I've lived over here for so long, in some of the interviews leading up to the election, and you hear a little bit of it over here, I'm sorry to say, of people saying, they're just trying to take away our freedoms. Why should I have to wear a mask? I have the freedom not to wear a mask. And that comes from this same very individualist thing that I think is associated with the rural environment. Whereas in an urban environment, you encounter lots of people every day who you don't know. That you have no connection with them except you happen to see them en route. Maybe some of them you see more than once. And that does automatically, I think, lead people to a little bit more, even though we may come from an individualist perspective, adopting a bit more of a collectivist approach. The other influence down in Texas and across the South is you do have the Hispanic influence feeding in. And although, yes, in South Florida, you've got the Cuban expats, which are rather different, the Hispanic cultures are collectivist cultures. And they do have an influence. And if you look at a small urban area in Texas, San Antonio, I think it's an interesting mix because in some ways you could see it as very conservative, but in other ways it's really very left-leaning, and you see a lot of progressive things there. So the urban-rural difference, I think, is probably the biggest, most important difference that you see. But the other important difference, and this relates to some of the things that have been said earlier, is in this country, the party whip is actually rather important, because if you are a member of parliament, as long as you have the party whip, nobody can stand opposed to you to stand for your party come the next election. And of course, in the States, yes, there is a party whip, but it doesn't have anywhere near the same power. And so for somebody like Biden, even if the Republicans control the Senate, remember, as Ron pointed out, a third of the Senate's going to come up for election in 2 years. And another way to look at it is a third of the Senate were there 2 years before Trump got elected. And these are not necessarily Trumpist senators. They may be Republicans, but they're not necessarily Trumpist. And so the ability for these people to change the side of the aisle they vote on is actually much stronger than it tends to be over here. I mean, we see it over here, but over there it's much stronger. So anyway, and then just the final little point, and this I'm making not so much as an American, but my background, I'm a retired academic in the field of psychology, is as somebody who holds the views and perspective of the left, we share this, and in a way we would like to just change the world and make it be right. But that's not going to happen. And to be honest, Bernie Sanders was much closer to my heart than Joe Biden. But I thank anything there is to thank that Biden was the candidate and not Sanders, because if Sanders was the candidate, Trump would have been reelected. And we know that because you can't change people by just forcing them to make a big change. You've got to somehow understand their perspective in order to help to see how to get them to understand your perspective. And one of the most powerful things I think I've heard Biden say since he was elected was that we have to stop seeing our opponents as enemies. They're our opponents, they're not our enemies. And that means we have to communicate with them. We have to share ideas and see if we can bring them to see our perspective. And I thought that was really valuable. Biden's not perfect, but I think he's a big step in the right direction right now. And yes, he's a safe pair of hands, but maybe that's what we need to stop people being what feels like is approaching a civil war, of everybody seeing the other side as an enemy. So that's my little comment.
Paul, you're muted. You're muted, Paul. We can't hear you.
I know, sorry, idiot. I am.
Can I come in very briefly?
Yeah,
Just
you've got 2 minutes each to kind of pull things together and roughly. I mean, we can go over 9 o'clock, but not too long over 9, please.
Okay. This is going to be a drill for me. In terms of Palestine and Israel, there'll be no significant change. I have to make reference to the Democratic National Committee. They didn't even recognize that Israel is occupying the West Bank and East Jerusalem. That says a lot. Okay, we'll continue to see the pro-Zionist policies in the Democratic administration. Okay, Sean, about an area of the United States which you might want to leave. If you're in Puerto Rico, which is a Commonwealth, I think you might want, that might be a real boost for the independence movement, because Trump basically really just dumped on Puerto Rico when Puerto Rico had a severe debt crisis and suffering from the damage from hurricanes. The United States government didn't come to bail out Puerto Rico. Catherine is quite right. There's a very long history of divide between rural and urban areas in the United States. The major source of support for nativism, which was another way of saying xenophobia, opposition to immigrants, was in rural areas. Support for prohibition largely came from rural areas. Okay, the anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic fervor in the United States largely was based in rural areas, not in cities. Cities are much more diverse. All right, you're going to mingle with people from various backgrounds, where religion, ethnicity, race, politics, and might breed a greater degree of tolerance than it would if you live in a rural area, basically when you're basically seeing the same people who live in your bubble. Okay, now this is my closing remark. One of the things we tend to forget when we're talking about politics, that people who don't see eye to eye with us often occupy a different universe. All right, I think the many followers of Trump occupy a completely different universe. They think differently. They see things quite differently from us. They don't even speak the same language, literally. So I think Catherine's attempt basically to argue for tolerance and empathy and communication and dialogue is going to be very, very difficult, because you have to find a common ground, all right, to basically engage with each other. So I think I'll leave it at that. Susan, you can have the last word.
I want to thank Catherine very quickly, because I was talking with friends in Texas and other places in the States about the urban-rural divide, and that's something that is essential, needs to be discussed. And, and in some senses, yes, we can, okay, here they're not evil, they're not murdering children, they're not running people, making child prostitutes and running pizza places and insanity like that. And if you look at Georgia, that's a very good example, because if you looked at how people voted in urban Georgia and rural Georgia, they're miles apart. I mean, they elected a QAnon supporter in the 14th district of Georgia, while you had the highest Black vote in Georgia, and I don't know how long. So, but that is a problem that Ron has raised, because divide and rule is a very successful strategy, and that's why it's been in use for so long. If they can keep us fighting each other, then there's little, and we see each other as enemies, then how do we unite when they spend so long creating this false hatred? Trying to see other people as human beings is something that, unfortunately, this is one of the things that is going to take time, because I don't think Joe Biden saying what he said is going to fix the damage that has been done from Ronald Reagan forward. And what we're seeing is the culmination and also the culmination of neoliberalism, which destroyed both industry, destroyed workers' wages, destroyed working conditions, and destroyed their trade unions, and of course the constant attack on women. Most women look at someone like Trump and they're like, well, why? You know, you can't even get to an understanding as to why they hate women so much and why someone like Trump is so deeply threatened by strong women. What is there a basis for communication when people agree with him? And that's a very hard thing to get around. And in that sense, you know, I think Ron raised an important point. And I also think that Catherine did it. Just want to thank everybody. On Palestine, well, at least he's allowing the Palestinians to hang themselves rather than tell them what they should do. So they already said they're going to talk to the Palestinians, bring them back into trade talks. But it's, you know, put it this way, Trump was basically trying to disempower them by bringing together people who wanted to make economic deals with the U.S. and military deals with the U.S. and to unify with the Israeli government and state. At least they've had promise that they will bring them back into discussion. And I don't know if it's going to do anything because Biden is a right-wing Zionist, and you know, but who knows? It's better than being so far. I saw Hannah Ashrari today, and she said maybe. There was an interview with her on CNN, and she said it can't be worse than Trump. I don't know, but you know, it's always so horrible there. So.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for an excellent discussion and contributions and what have you. I posted on the chat the ISW email address. If anybody wants to be added to the email address for future meetings, then just send me an email and I can add you to the address. Just a quickie announcement before we close. In 2 weeks' time, or 2 weeks tomorrow, we've got the normal ISW meeting, which is always on the fourth Thursday of every month. So on the 26th of November, and we're very pleased to have a real activist and campaigner for disabled rights coming to talk to us, Bob Williams-Findlay, who some of you will know. I mean, Bob is an excellent campaigner, and he's just finished a book, More Than a Left Foot, which I've got here. A wonderful little book, actually, because it combines his personal journey from of when he grew up with living with his disability and people's perceptions of him, right through to university and his political activism at Essex University, and then through his activism on disabled rights to the present day, working sometimes in local authorities and also for disabled organisations. But it's entitled Nothing. It's his title. He said he's going to be talking about Nothing Special but Quite Unique is the title of his contribution. And so it's at 7:30 on the 26th of November in 2 weeks' time. Like I say, drop me an email and I can let you know the details and the log-on details for Zoom. But thank you very much, and that's the end, folks. And I'm sure we'll meet again sometime. So it's been great to meet you.
Everyone
all.
for their very
everyone.
provocative comments and questions. And Susan, it's been a pleasure to meet you.
It's lovely to meet you. Thanks, everyone. Beautiful. Thank you, Catherine, because
And Paul,
that
thanks
was
for organizing.
wonderful.
Great
Thanks,
job.
everybody, for organizing, and Paul, thank you. Well, let me
No
know
problem.
about Bob, because he's just a wonderful guy. So I'd love to be there. You know,
I'll let you know, Susan, through the
because
usual
he's
forums.
a friend as well as a comrade. He's just a wonderful guy, and I helped edit the book. So
Yeah, I noticed that actually.
it's wonderful. He's just
Yeah.
wonderful.
Okay, so thank you very much, and
Thank you.
bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
See you soon.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you.
Thank you.